The study of the Carolina Bays has become a battleground between proponents of the eolian and lacustrine hypothesis, which claims that wind and water created the bays by gradualistic processes over a long period of time, and by proponents of various impact hypotheses, which claim that oblique impacts by projectiles of some sort created the Carolina Bays. A crucial part of the debate involves the elliptical geometry of the bays and their radial orientation toward the convergence point by the Great Lakes. The question of the geometry of the Carolina Bays can finally be settled by fitting them with ellipses using the least squares method. Well-preserved Carolina Bays are definitely conic sections. In 1933, Melton and Shriver considered that the Carolina Bays were meteorite scars. Although the orientation of the bays and their shapes were suggestive of a meteorite shower, no pieces of meteorites were found in or around the bays. Melton and Shriver noted that the ellipticity of the Carolina Bays varies by their diameter, and that the ellipticity is greater for the large bays than for the small ones. They plotted the ellipticity as a function of bay length. They also stated that meteors striking plastic material at angles between 35 and 55 degrees from the vertical would produce indentations elliptical in outline. The reason for the more circular shape of the smaller bays was attributed to atmospheric friction, which would cause smaller projectiles to impact the Earth at more vertical angles. In 1952, William Prouty also suggested that the Carolina Bays were of impact origin and pointed out that multiple and heart-shaped bays overlap in patterns explained most logically by the impact of tandem meteorites. Prouty confirmed the finding by Melton and Shriver that the ellipticity of the bays varies by length. From the very beginning, the elliptical geometry of the Carolina Bays has been associated with hypotheses about their impact origin and the angle of the impact. In 1942, Professor Douglas Johnson from Columbia University wrote a book entitled The Origin of the Carolina Bays, where he proposed that the bays originated from lakes formed by artesian springs whose sandy rims were formed by the action of the wind. Throughout his book, Professor Johnson referred to the bays as having an oval rather than an elliptical shape, even though it is relatively easy to verify the elliptical geometry of the bays in the images that he published in his book. Professor Johnson considered the Carolina Bays to be blowouts created by wind erosion that were bordered by dunes. One chapter of his book describes the Aeolian phase of his hypothesis. Johnson dismissed the elliptical geometry of the bays, saying that the photographs of bays selected for publication have a perfection of outline that is not typical of the thousands of photographs on file at various survey offices. He wrote, quote, "Accounts of the bays have properly emphasized the remarkable oval forms revealed by aerial photographs, for it is the degree of perfection of these ovals and the degree of parallelism of their longer axes which arouse wonder and incite the observer to seek an explanation for their origin. The critical student must not, however, lose sight of the fact that perfect ovals, whether of the elliptical or ovoid type, are the exception, not the rule." End quote. The Carolina Bays in Johnson's book can be fitted with ellipses by taking sample points along the rims of the base of his figure number 3. A least squares fit shows that the perimeter is mathematically elliptical. It is evident that Johnson did not want to characterize the Carolina Bays as ellipses, which have a precise mathematical definition. Instead, he referred to them as being oval, which is an arbitrary egg shape. Professor Johnson's description deserves 2 monkeys. Even in 2020, the rims of the Carolina Bays are described by Christopher Sweezy of the U.S. Geological Survey as adjacent to eolian dunes that are primarily parabolic. Christopher Sweezy, like Douglas Johnson, is reluctant to describe the Carolina Bays as elliptical. In this publication, he characterizes Herndon Bay as an oval Carolina Bay. It is relatively easy to fit Herndon Bay with an ellipse by taking sample points along the rim of the bay. All the sample points fall on the perimeter of an ellipse fitted by the least squares method. Herndon Bay is definitely elliptical and not oval. Dr. Sweezy's description also deserves 2 monkeys. Sweezy references the 2016 publication by Moore et al. That describes sand ridges along Herndon Bay. The paper by Moore says that single-grain optically stimulated luminescence ages place the initial formation of each sand rim from oldest to most recent as about 36.7, 29.6, and 27.2 thousand years ago. The paper describes processing the samples as follows. Quote, A combined total of 1,079 grains were measured for all three samples, but using a set of criterion for evaluating the signals from each grain, only 224 grains were accepted for analysis, a 20.8 acceptance rate." End quote. In essence, only about 20% of the samples were used to derive the dating results. The problem of selecting specific data points can be illustrated with this example of 1,000 points. If we select all the points, we can fit them with an ellipse by using a least squares method. However, if we select only 20% of the same points, we can make them fit a rectangle or a circle, depending on our selection criteria. Selecting only 20% of the points that meet specific criteria may be considered cherry picking, which is the practice of taking only the most beneficial items from what is available. Although there may be justification for selecting specific data, this process usually biases the results to support the selection criteria. It is not a good scientific practice. Recognizing that the Carolina bays are elliptical makes it possible to consider that they originated as inclined conical cavities, and this makes their impact origin plausible. The glacier ice impact hypothesis proposes that the Carolina bays originated as oblique impacts of glacier ice ejected by one or more extraterrestrial impacts on the Laurentide ice sheet. Many papers have been published about the Carolina bays, attributing their origin to uniformitarian wind and water mechanisms. The dating of the sand rims and the arguments saying that the bays developed through stronger than present southwesterly winds blowing over water ponded in shallow depressions are all intended to prove that a catastrophic origin is neither supported by geological data nor needed to explain features attributed to the Carolina bays. However, accepting that the Carolina bays have elliptical morphology implies an impact origin that threatens to undermine the foundation of the arguments for the Aeolian lacustrine hypothesis. Scientists who have worked for decades on the wind and water hypothesis and published many papers on this topic are very reluctant to change their opinion and accept the impact origin of the Carolina bays. A paradigm shift is painful, and it takes many years for the new ideas to be widely accepted. The Ptolemaic system that placed the Earth at the center of the universe had been in use since the 2nd century, but in the 16th century, Copernicus introduced a heliocentric system where all the planets revolved around the Sun. In 1616, the Catholic Church issued a prohibition against the Copernican model of the solar system. The Roman Inquisition under Pope Urban VIII in 1633 found Galileo suspect of heresy for supporting the Copernican system based on his astronomical observations with a telescope. Galileo was sentenced to house arrest, where he remained until his death in 1642. The acceptance of the impact origin of the Carolina bays also requires a paradigm shift. One of the most contentious concepts of the impact hypothesis is that all the Carolina bays were created contemporaneously within a few seconds of each other instead of gradually over thousands of years. The second controversial topic is that the dates of the terrain do not correspond to the date of emplacement of the bays. A basic problem is that optically stimulated luminescence, which is a very accurate way of dating buried quartz crystals, is intended for use in sedimentary terrain and not on a landscape whose stratigraphy was scrambled by the barrage of projectiles that formed the Carolina bays. The only thing that we can do to promote the impact origin of the Carolina bays is to demonstrate the elliptical geomorphology for as many Carolina bays as possible, so that the deniers can no longer deny and the ignorers can no longer ignore the facts. As part of that effort, today we will take a look at Salters Lake Bay and Jones Lake Bay in North Carolina. The lakes are part of a state park in North Carolina. Sampling points along the rim of Jones Lake Bay, we can fit an ellipse that passes through those points using the least squares fitting procedure. Using the same sampling procedure for Salters Lake also yields a good fit between the points on the rim of the bay and the perimeter of the ellipse. Notice that the sampled points were not taken on the northwest part of the bay because the rim is undefined there. The rim seems to flow into the small bay. Only 5 points of an elliptical curve are needed to fit an ellipse, so the complete ellipse can be reconstructed even if there are some gaps in the sample points. The small bay on the northwest side of Salters Lake Bay is also elliptical. The west rim of the small bay is obscured by a road, and its southeast edge was completely covered by the emplacement of Salters Lake Bay. The small bay to the southeast of Jones Lake Bay is also elliptical. We can see that the thickened rim of Jones Lake Bay overlays the western part of the small bay, and no sample points were taken at that location. From the law of superposition, we know that the small bays were created before the large bays. A portion of the rim of Salters Lake Bay flowed into the small bay that was previously emplaced toward its northwest. Jones Lake Bay was emplaced after the small bay to its southeast. We can tell this because the rim of Jones Lake Bay overlays the small bay. Thank you for joining me in the investigation of the Carolina Bays and the Younger Dryas Cataclysm. I will continue to examine the Carolina Bays one bay at a time. My book about the Carolina Bays is available at Amazon. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel to be notified of future videos about the Carolina Bays. Such sad faces, deniers and ignorers. You can't know the truth if you don't use your senses. Open your mouth. Talk about ellipses. Open your eyes. Look at the ellipses. Uncover your ears. Hear about the ellipses. Expand your mind. There's more than meets the eye. A great hailstorm of glacier ice created this landscape. All the Carolina Bays were created within a few seconds of each other.